All right, continuing on with Exhibit B, Darwin is going to be arguing that the position of species around the planet is a clue to species origin. We've seen how polar bears exist in the northern hemisphere and not in the south. Darwin would explain this by saying polar bears evolved in the north and then were not able as a species to migrate to other suitable habitats in the south. Notice that's a very different type of explanation than saying that God simply placed species in their suitable habitats all over the world. If so, you might expect polar bears to live down in the southern hemisphere as well, but they do not. Now, on his journey around the world, Darwin was very interested in his observations of oceanic islands. The Galapagos Islands are one famous example of oceanic islands. There are also islands off the west coast of Africa called the Cape Verde Islands. Here we see the Galapagos Islands. Now, they are oceanic islands because they are hundreds of miles away from the nearest continent, and they never were attached to the continent in their history. So these islands, these land masses, arose out of the sea. They are volcanoes, the tops of volcanoes. So as these islands emerged from the sea, they were molten rock, right, that cooled. And so they were lifeless regions of land. Now, obviously today there's life on them. So this is what made oceanic islands interesting to Darwin, because they began as lifeless places, and now living species have colonized them. And so maybe Darwin thought he could get some insight into species change by studying oceanic islands. So again, oceanic islands are hundreds of miles away from the nearest continent, and they were never attached. They are the tops of undersea volcanoes. Now let's consider then these two sets of islands, the Cape Verde Islands off of Africa and the Galapagos Islands off of South America. Both of the sets of islands are volcanic, and they have very similar climates. So again, in Darwin's time, there was this idea of the climate hypothesis. With these islands being so similar, perhaps God would place similar species on these islands, right? Whichever species have adaptations suitable to those kind of conditions. Well, if they're suitable to the Cape Verde Island conditions, then they would also be suitable for the Galapagos Islands. So from this point of view, we might expect to find similar species on these two sets of oceanic islands. They're both volcanic, and they have similar climates. Notice we can use our if and then. If God placed species on Earth according to their adaptations for climate only, and we compare species on Galapagos and Cape Verde Islands, they should be similar, right? But here's what Darwin found. Interestingly, he found that the species of plants and animals on the Cape Verde Islands were most closely related, most similar to the species on the west coast of Africa. And the species in the Galapagos Islands were most similar to the species on the west coast of South America. In other words, the species on these oceanic islands were not very similar to each other. They were more similar to the species on the nearest mainland. Now, why would that be, says Darwin to himself? Well, his explanation, you can probably surmise by this point, is that he argues that the species on these oceanic islands can trace their ancestry back to the nearest continental species. In the past, it was species from the continent that colonized the islands and then changed. And it's important to note here that the species on these oceanic islands are different species than the ones on the continental mainland here, both in the case of Cape Verde Islands and Galapagos Islands. So it's not that the continental species simply just colonized and then stayed the same species. What Darwin's arguing is that the reason why these are different species from the continental islands is that the ancestors migrated out to those islands, but then changed over time. They evolved new adaptations, new characteristics to the new environment. So again, the climate hypothesis seems weakened here because you might expect similar species on these oceanic islands. They're volcanic, very similar in nature, similar climates, but we don't find that. We see a pattern, and this pattern holds true for other oceanic islands as well. that the species you find on oceanic islands are most similar to the species on the nearest mainland. And that would most easily be explained if we hypothesize that it was mainland ancestors that colonized the islands and then evolved into new species over time.